Dr. Anthony Fauci says he knows Americans are done with COVID restrictions, but it doesn't matter.
Fauci saying folks need to be ready for them to return because cases of a new strain of COVID are on the rise.
Yeah, I'm sure people are happy to hear all of this. Let's bring in Kentucky Republican Senator Rand Paul. Senator, great to have you here and good to see you. I feel like we just teed you up. We know where you stand on Dr. Anthony Fauci. You've called for his resignation and beyond. Is there any tolerance for more restrictions if we see cases rise?
Well, this should come as a shock to no one that Anthony Fauci is once again misunderstanding, misinterpreting, and misapplying the data. The data is this: we have a lower incidence of COVID now than we've had since the beginning of the pandemic, lower death rate, lower hospitalization rate, and better ability to treat it than we have during the entire pandemic. So he's just flat out wrong. And what we should be talking about is that if you do get it, or if you're susceptible, if you're in your 80s or 70s and your spouse gets it, there is a treatment, but all of the treatments work best if you're treated early before your symptoms get too bad. So Anthony Fauci won't tell you this, but I will. The monoclonal antibodies, if you get them in the first several days, are enormously successful. But if you wait, they won't give them to you. If you wait until you're sick enough to go to the hospital, Anthony Fauci and the government doctors have dictated that you cannot get monoclonal antibodies as an inpatient. Yeah. This is a real tragedy, but there are treatments, and people need to know what the treatments are. But the good news is the pandemic is on the wane. Lower incidence, lower hospitalizations, lower death rate since the beginning of the pandemic.
Senator, just because many people out there may not believe that Anthony Fauci is talking about this, let's roll the tape back and you can listen for yourself.
I don't think there's much stomach for people to all of a sudden turn around, even if there is an uptick. I think there's going to be a lot of inertia, if not active pushback in people, if it is required to increase or go back to some of the mitigation. So the advice is proceed with life as normal as you possibly can, but be prepared that we might need to make modifications if things change.
Not much stomach to go back. I can imagine people with pitchforks coming over the hill.
Well, here's the thing is, if you believe in Dr. Fauci, what you should do immediately is go get stickers and make sure they're on the floor everywhere you go, so and a yardstick, so you know that you're 6 feet away from people. And plexiglass, carry plexiglass around with you, because Dr. Fauci thinks that plexiglass somehow, reflects the virus away from you. None of what he's been for has worked. Not one thing he has advocated other than the vaccine, and I'm not against the vaccine, but the interesting thing is this, and he won't admit this to the public. If you take a sample of blood from 1,000 people anywhere in the United States and you measure to see if they have antibodies to the virus or antibodies to the vaccine, it's over 95%. That's why we're doing better with this. We have developed immunity, either from having the disease or from being vaccinated, and that's why we're doing better, in addition to the fact that the virus has mutated to a less virulent or less deadly form. But he won't admit it because he's so caught up in putting stickers on the floor, putting masks on your face, putting goggles on you. The guy's a menace, and he hasn't been right really about anything since the start of this.
Well, you always tell us exactly how you feel, Senator, and I will tell you that what you're saying is backed up, as far as the restrictions are concerned, is backed up by the latest Johns Hopkins University. Their meta-analysis used several studies, they said, which found lockdowns had little to no impact in reducing fatalities from COVID during the spring of 2020. They concluded that the lockdowns were ill-founded and instead resulted in enormous economic and social costs where they had been adopted. So how is it, based on that science, that we can even be considering this or talking about restrictions, even if this is a worst-case scenario and cases do indeed spike?
The reason we're in this situation is because we have allowed a central planner, Dr. Fauci, to be in charge of everything. In a free society, everyone's in charge of their own health care, and you go to doctors until you find a doctor that you think has an opinion that is valid, and you get your choice. So if Dr. Fauci were a family doctor in Peoria, he would only be damaging the people silly enough to see him as a doctor. But because he's employed by the government and his dictates go down throughout the system, as he makes errors, they're promulgated everywhere. But his biggest error is pessimism. I mean, he's already worried. He's shaking and wringing his hands. We know it's coming back, and you have to stay inside, shelter in place. There is no evidence of that. The evidence is we're getting better. And for those who do get sick, The main thing he should be telling you, which he's not telling you, is there is treatment. The sooner you get the treatment, the better. If you are 80 years old and your spouse has COVID, you can get treatment with no symptoms and with no positive test. That's how good the treatment is. And that's what they do for people who are at high risk. But he's not telling you any of that. He's just saying, oh, we need to vaccinate newborns, which is untrue and not supported by the science.
They haven't even taken the masks off the toddlers here in Manhattan. New York, if you've got children under 5, they are still required to wear a mask to be in schools and daycare
Pretty
centers.
amazing.
And
Hey,
the death rate for children under 15 is 1 in 2.32 million. Less than 1 in a million. That's the death rate. There's no reason for any child in America to be in a mask. In Sweden, they wore no masks, and no children died.
Senator, I want to switch gears quickly, and time is growing short here, but you wrote about this, so I wanted to ask you about it. The White House continues to insist that inflation will begin to mitigate later on this year. Jerome Powell, as he's beginning to raise interest rates, says it's probably going to take 2 to 3 years. What's the inflation outlook to you?
Well, it certainly isn't transitory anymore. I mean, they kept telling us it's transitory. To my mind, 3 years is not transitory. But you can't fix inflation unless you know what causes it. Inflation is caused by debt, deficit spending, and the Federal Reserve printing up new money to buy the debt, monetization of the debt. That's where inflation comes from. So the more debt, the more inflation. We're paying the bills of $6 trillion worth of debt that we had in the last 2 years. Both parties are responsible for it, Republicans and Democrats. But the answer isn't adding more debt. The answer is being more fiscally responsible. And I don't know of a Democrat in Washington, in Congress, that is promoting any fiscal discipline.
Let me just follow up on that, because I've got my econ panel coming up, and I'll use what you say now with them. Would you be in favor of a Paul Volcker style addressing of the inflation situation right now that we saw in the 80s, where he tackled it so severely that there was major economic consequences, short-term interest rates, short-term spiked above 20%. Houses were not selling, cars were not selling, but it fixed the problem of the 1970s. Would you be in favor of that aggressive approach for Jay Powell?
What I will say is the first thing is don't add more to your debt. So try to balance your budget or get closer to balance. As far as interest rates, I saw a statistic the other day that I thought was interesting. Over the average of the last 50 years, the Federal Reserve's discount rate has been a point above inflation. Right now, it's 8 points below inflation. So you have negative interest rates. It's sort of like free money. If you got 8% inflation, you can borrow money for 2 or 3%.
For a while,
why not? Yeah, why not just keep borrowing money? So we're in a situation that's inflationary. And as far as when or how you raise interest rates, that's a technical question.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure I have the answer. But what I do have the answer is you should not have interest rates that are negative, and you shouldn't have interest rates that are below inflation. And that's what we have now.
All right. Well, we'll be looking forward to discussing that with the panel coming up. As always, Senator
Great to have
Rand
you,
Paul.
Senator. Thank you.
Good to talk to you.
you.
Thanks.